Great. Well, first of all, Arun, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of your service design book club. I really appreciate it and looking forward to visiting with you all today. I'm going to, Arun has asked me to talk specifically about chapter three, which is about how I went about designing the leadership team and what I think about and what I see out in the world for successful transformation efforts and what the leadership team of those transformation programs look like. In order to set that up, let me just give you a little bit of sense for where I was at the time in terms of my thinking, because it really informs everything about how I think successful change programs kind of work. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, and then at any time, interrupt or I'm glancing at the chat, but if you want to just interrupt and say stop, like you're being ridiculous, or if you have questions, whatever you want me to expand on. This is really your hour, and I want to do whatever I can to kind of help you understand kind of the concepts behind the book and the intention behind the book, as well as just kind of the tactics of how I went about selecting the leadership team. As Arun said, my third startup was bought by IBM in 2010. And I won't go into the details, it's in the book, but how I got to the point in 2012 when I was asked to essentially make all of IBM, which at the time was approaching 400,000 people operating across 180 countries, make all of that look more like the way my startup operated than the way IBM operated at the time. And as I thought about that problem and the fundamental difference, kind of where IBM was at the time, it had completely missed, for example, cloud computing, modern cloud computing. It was missing major trends in the marketplace that didn't require great prognostication skills. It just required a new way to listen to what was going on out in the world and using the users of our products and services as our eyes and ears for what's happening out in the world. And that fundamental thing, which we can call empathy for the purposes of today, was missing in how IBM took products and services to market. And the fundamental basis of how I had built my third company was using design thinking in all respects. Every function, every person was really tasked with gaining empathy and developing insights into how the users of whatever it was they were doing, whether it was internal or external, how the users of what they were delivering, how their lives could be a little bit better. And that was really what we intended to do at IBM, was to really turn what was not simply an engineering-centric company, which isn't bad in and of itself, but which was to turn a company that was really internally focused on our own stories and taking those to the market, whether the market wanted to hear them or not, and not really listening to where the market was going. And so when I was asked to help transform IBM fundamentally, not just in what we did, but how we did it, the real problem in front of me wasn't to figure out what was needed. You can call it design thinking and agile. You can call it lean startup. There's any number of methods or approaches that might lead to the same result. But the real challenge was that it was 400,000 people, none of whom reported to me. And as I started thinking about that problem, one of the things that I did is I went around to a lot of companies who had really great cultures of listening and learning. And primarily, these are the companies that we would know today as being great in design. And it wasn't just tech companies. Certainly, I visited Apple, but I also visited places like Hermes, the Coca-Cola company, John Deere tractors, companies that actually had a brawn, that had a long legacy of responding and actually leading changes in the market, and also delivering goods and services that people really craved and people went back for again and again and again. And I also visited a lot of companies who weren't known for that, but companies that I knew had design programs and design teams in place. And what I found across all of those companies was this, that you could almost completely interchange their design teams and you wouldn't notice a difference. In other words, all of the design teams were actually very good and very competent, even at companies that weren't really known for doing design very well. But what I found is that everybody who wasn't a designer at the design forward companies valued design. And this happened over and over and over again. As I went to companies that were great at design, the difference between them and companies that weren't great at design weren't the design teams, it was all of the non-designers. And I realized that it was these companies' cultures that were actually the drivers of great design more than just the designers. And as I was thinking about these two things of 400,000 people, none of whom report to me, and it was the cultures of the companies that really did a good job at design and listening to the market and listening to their users, were all the non-designers, that it struck me why many change programs fail. A lot of people, especially in the early 2000s, a lot of people tried to become kind of Silicon Valley startups, or I should say, they tried to interject certain Silicon Valley startup kind of behaviors into some part of their organization. They would go find some cool place out in the Bay Area that had brick walls and exposed ductwork, and they would put an innovation team inside there, and they would say, "Go create great things." And company after company, from large organizations, they all built these innovation teams, these innovation spaces, and none of those teams were having an impact on the organization. And as I was kind of making sense of this kind of soup of information or soup of data, I started to realize that change has to happen in the mainstream business. It can't happen because of some other. The only way a company is transformed is if their mainstream operations get transformed. And that's, again, it's a cultural issue. And the things that get in the way of mainstream teams innovating and listening and doing the work of empathy at scale and gaining insights from user research, the things that get in the way of that are typically the systems and the processes of the organization itself. And that's why these flashy innovation teams or flashy temporary tiger teams operating in some entity, that's external to the mainstream business, when they bring their ideas into the mainstream business, a couple of things happen. First of all of the mainstream people kind of get very defensive about it, and they start pushing back on these changes because they happened out in some other world. And the other thing that pushes back on successful changes or innovations are the systems and processes that are in place to reinforce corporate behavior. To get to a company like IBM with 400,000 people, it requires global systems, HR systems, tooling that the CIO operates and hardens and makes sure are safe and secure for the organization. All of these things work together to deliver consistent experiences globally. And that consistency helps a company scale. You can't have random pay scales. You can't have random career paths from site to site and country to country. You have to have standardization in order to scale and to deal with all of that organizational chaos and to create some momentum forward. And that's great right up until the moment where the things that you're reinforcing and scaling are the wrong things for its time. And that's what happens when organizations need to transform. The reason you're transforming is not just to transform because change is good. The reason companies move into needing change and needing transformation is because something they're doing in the marketplace isn't resonating, or they need to move faster to keep up with their competition. They need to do something different to take market share from a competitor that is moving faster and doing better work. And so you have this kind of dichotomy where change is needed, and individuals and teams may even be embracing that change, but you have the organizational systems and tools that are part of the old, that are reinforcing the old behaviors. All of those things need to change, in addition to inserting the specific thing that you're, what I call the change provocation, that you're trying to get people to adopt. And this is really key, that the thing you're trying to get people to adopt, in our case, it was design and design thinking and agile, is completely separate from all of the systems and processes that reinforce behaviors in teams. Just a very tactical example. If you're trying to insert design thinking into the guts of an organization, or if you're trying to insert AI today into the mainstream operations of every team in the organization, if the career paths of the people on those teams don't recognize the progressive skills that individuals need to attain in that new thing, whether it's design thinking or agile or whatever's coming next, if the HR systems aren't in place to reinforce and to ensure that those skills are adopted and expanded as people advance in their careers, then there's no reason for people to sustainably adopt these things. The same thing with tooling. In the case of IBM, the tooling itself didn't facilitate the interdisciplinary collaboration that design thinking requires. We were using, in some cases, tool chains that dated back to the 1990s. And so to bring in modern tools, you have to think about all of the things that the CIO and the procurement office of the organization has to change in order to insert these tools at scale into the teams as they adopt the new technologies and behaviors that you want them to adopt. All of these things are the background to how I then started thinking about my leadership team. I started thinking about this in terms of a virus model. The virus in a virus like COVID-19 is actually a very small thing, and it's protected by this protein shell, what's called the capsid. And that protein, that shell around the potent virus, design thinking, AI, the shell around it has these protein spikes that are built to attach to the mothership. They look like things that the mothership wants. And so it attaches, and then the virus is released. That's kind of how I started thinking about my leadership team. That if changing HR systems and career ladders for the skills that were needed globally, and in our case, it was essentially every single one of 400,000 people had to begin to change behaviors, and we had to move them into a place where they started valuing the design thinking and design practices that we were inserting, which were the virus. Those were the change provocations. Those were the powerful differences we were bringing into the culture. But we had to change those scaled systems and attach to those scaled systems so that they started changing their own ways of nurturing the virus as it was being adopted throughout the organization. So I started thinking about my leadership team like that. Uh, I was obviously my title was general manager of design, but I was the head of the transformation program. And I realized that I needed this HR spike. I needed somebody to interface with the global HR systems so that over the course of what turned out to be about 4 years, over the course of that time, we could actually impact the career ladders of virtually every profession inside of IBM. And at each rung of those ladders, as people progress through their careers, they were expected to embrace the values of our program more and more and more. Those values were user-centered, focus on users, relentless iteration and prototyping, and diverse, interdisciplinary, empowered teams. Those values as people's careers, whether you were in sales or whether you were in design or whether you were in engineering, those values and the expression of those values in your work, we had to make that an explicit part of getting promoted. The same thing with the tools. I needed somebody to interact with our CIO organization. If we are going to change something like AI systems, the tool chain around teams need to change pretty radically to embrace that thing. And it's usually the CIO organization that that controls access to the tools of an organization. So I needed somebody to develop a relationship with, to infiltrate, if you will, our global CIO organization and make them a part and a partner to our program, so that we could, first of all, pilot new technologies as we scaled out the change initiative, but then also to make them not pilot technologies, but actually make them the new global standard for all of the teams at IBM. Same thing with procurement. I needed to have somebody who had relationships in our procurement department so that we could procure the new tools. And the same thing finally with communications, where we needed to leverage the global communications effort of IBM's communications units with new messaging that reinforced internally and externally the new values and the new skills and the new behaviors that we wanted to reinforce. And ultimately, to start telling that story to the analysts and to the business media that covered IBM as we started to get successes. Also on my leadership team were what we called our CTO, which was really the head designer. And it actually turned out to be two people, one of whom was responsible primarily for the design thinking and the integration of design thinking into the broader skill sets of IBM. That was Charlie Hill. And then the person who was actually responsible for design, which at the beginning was Adam Cutler. So if you looked at my leadership team, it was built of design and design thinking. These people were working solely with the teams that were involved in the program. And then the rest of my team, which was more than 50% of it, were dealing with HR, CIO, procurement, and communications, the big scaled out systems of the organization. If you look at the work that we did over the years, easily more than 50% of the work that my team did was outside what you would think of as design and design thinking. That was a really radical approach to bringing change into an organization. In most efforts, the change is led by an expert in that thing. I'm not a designer. I'm not a trained designer. I'm a product guy. I know how to run products. I know how to build programs. And I love design and design thinking, but that's not who I am. That was a very different kind of approach. In fact, there were a lot of people who lead design change efforts who are designers, and they would either get frustrated that I was leading the one at IBM, and typically get frustrated because they weren't as successful in bringing about large scale change, because they approached it as a design is good problem, as opposed to the culture of non-designers have to value design as the central problem of a change program. Um, it's kind of funny as I relate these stories to folks, and typically I'm brought in today into large organizations that are undergoing change efforts, and I'm typically brought in after a couple of years of attempts, and and they're just not seeing it stick. Uh, for those of you who have read John Kotter's book, Leading Change, which is the canon of change management strategy, and a great book. It was released in the mid 90s. John Kotter was a Harvard professor. And it certainly impacted my business life greatly. Uh, and they try to follow it, but I ask two questions of most efforts that are in the midst of failing. The first one is, tell me about the first teams that you chose. How did you start to roll it out? And there's typically some anti-patterns, and I cover that in the next chapter in the book, chapter 4. The second question I asked is, tell me about the leadership team. And typically, the leadership team of their change efforts are experts in the thing, but they're not necessarily experts in rolling out change programs. And in fact, the work of rolling out change programs doesn't really interest them as much as design systems or AI systems in today's world. So that's how I approached it. That's the kind of the intention behind the stories that I tell in the book. And like I say, it addresses one of the really fundamental issues that I see with change programs that fail. And that is that way too much time is spent on the thing, AI, design thinking, agile, and not very much time is spent on the things around the thing. And that's where the hard work really is. That's where the tedious long-term work really is. But once you infiltrate, in the book I say smuggle, once you smuggle your change into those scaled out systems, and you have the scaled out systems and processes working with you instead of being antibodies working against you, everything accelerates. And that's really, I think, the fundamental story of the program at IBM is how we thought about everything around design thinking, and agile, and really indexed most heavily on that, as opposed to over-indexing on the relatively straightforward introduction of our change provocation, design thinking, and agile. So with that, I'll kind of leave it there. Hopefully I gave you some intent behind it and didn't speak too abstractly. I'm going to open it up to questions from you all, because I think probably from your all's questions, we'll probably get to more of the specifics that might be more interesting to